The supply manifest showed 37 crates of mining equipment, 12 food containers, and one extremely nervous alien administrator. Neil Davies checked his datapad again as the cargo ramp lowered onto the dusty surface of Pharaoh 7. He had been hauling freight across this sector for 3 years, and he had never seen a colony look this scared. Prill met him at the loading zone with all 3 of his eyes darting around the perimeter fence. The Trilaxian was normally calm and professional, but today his skin had turned a pale yellow that Neil's orientation manual said meant fear. Behind him, other colonists were sealing doors and checking barrier generators like they expected an invasion. "You need to unload quickly and leave," Prill said, his translator device making his voice sound tinny. "The Razorback returned last night. It killed 2 of our perimeter drones and nearly breached the eastern barrier." Neil grabbed a crate and loaded it onto the transport cart. "Razorback?" Prill's eyes widened. "You do not know? The apex predator of this world? 6 meters tall armored hide that deflects most weapons, claws that can tear through steel. It has killed 43 colonists over the past decade." "Sounds rough," Neil said, moving another crate. He came from Montana, where bears occasionally wandered onto his family's ranch. 6 meters was big, sure, but it was still just an animal. The Trilaxian grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "You do not understand, human. When a razorback hunts, nothing survives. We have lost trained soldiers to these creatures. Your ship should leave immediately after unloading." Neil glanced toward the fence line where Prill kept looking. Through the heat shimmer of the desert air, he could see something moving in the rocks about 200 meters out. He pulled out his binoculars and focused on the creature. It was definitely big. The razorback looked like someone had crossed a rhinoceros with a grizzly bear and added extra armor plating. Its head was massive with a ridge of bone protecting its skull. 3 rows of teeth showed when it opened its mouth to taste the air. The creature was pacing along the barrier, testing for weaknesses. Neil lowered the binoculars and shrugged. "Looks like the cassowaries we have in Australia. Probably just territorial." Prill made a choking sound. "Territorial? It is a killing machine. Last month it destroyed an entire survey team. 8 people, human. 8 lives ended in minutes." "Yeah, but did the survey team provoke it?" Neil asked. He kept unloading crates while other colonists watched him like he had lost his mind. Back home, most animal attacks happen because people do something stupid. Get between a mother and her babies, surprise a predator while it's eating. Walk into marked territory. Animals are predictable if you know what you're looking at. A Vorlon security officer named Garvin approached them. He was tall and muscular with gray skin and facial ridges that marked him as a warrior caste. His hand rested on his plasma weapon, and his posture screamed military training. "The human does not understand the danger," Garvin said to Prill. "Razorbacks do not simply defend territory. They hunt for sport. I have seen one tear through a fortified bunker to reach prey inside." Neil finished with the last crate and wiped sweat from his forehead. The sun here was brutal, and he missed the cool mountain air of home. "How often does this razorback attack?" "It circles the colony every few days," Prill explained. "We have strengthened the barriers, but it is learning. Each time it finds our weaknesses faster. The Colony Council is considering evacuation." "Evacuation because of one animal?" Neil asked. Garvin's face darkened. "You mock what you do not comprehend. I have fought in 3 wars across this sector. I have faced enemy soldiers and hostile aliens and dangerous criminals. But a razorback?" He shook his head. "A razorback is death itself with claws and teeth." Neil was about to respond when alarms started blaring across the colony. Red lights spun on top of the barrier posts, and colonists started running toward the reinforced buildings in the center of the settlement. Prill grabbed his communicator and listened to rapid reports in his own language. "It is attacking Sector 7, Prill said, his voice shaking. "The barrier is failing." Through the fence, Neil could see the razorback charging at a weak point where 2 barrier generators met. The creature slammed into the energy field with its armored shoulder, and sparks flew. The barrier flickered, and the creature roared with a sound that shook the ground. Colonists were screaming and scrambling for shelter. Parents carried their children. Workers abandoned equipment. Garvin was shouting orders to his security team, but his voice had an edge of panic that Neil recognized from when his cousin had faced a bull that escaped its pen. The barrier failed. The energy field collapsed with a sound like breaking glass, and the razorback pushed through the gap. It stood in the colony proper now, its massive head swinging back and forth as it searched for targets. Colonists who had not reached shelter froze in terror. Neil watched from beside his ship. The creature was impressive, no doubt about that. It moved with power and confidence, and its roar would scare anyone who had never heard anything scarier. But Neil had grown up around animals that could kill with one kick or one bite. He had helped his grandfather calm a wounded bison that weighed over a ton. He had tracked mountain lions in winter and relocated aggressive coyotes from the property. This razorback was dangerous, sure, but it was still just an animal. He walked toward the armory building where Garvin was coordinating the defense. The Vorlon stared at him in disbelief. "What are you doing, human? Going to handle your razorback problem?" Neil said calmly. "You got a rifle I can borrow?" Garvin grabbed his shoulder. "You will die. This creature has killed soldiers with decades of combat experience." Neil looked at the razorback, then back at Garvin. "Yeah, well, I've dealt with wounded bison that weighed more than your security vehicle. Same principle. You just need to understand what you are dealing with." He pulled free from Garvin's grip and walked toward the armory. Behind him, Prill was saying something about insanity and human death wishes, but Neil was not listening. He was watching the razorback and reading its body language. The way it held its head, the way it moved, the way it kept looking back toward the rocks outside the colony. This was not a hunter looking for prey. This was a parent protecting something, and that changed everything. The armory smelled like gun oil and fear. Neil found a plasma rifle on the rack that looked simple enough to operate. He checked the charge and the safety mechanism while Garvin paced behind him like a caged animal. "This is suicide," the Vorlon warrior said for the third time. "You are a cargo worker, not a trained fighter. That creature will tear you apart before you fire a single shot." Neil slung the rifle over his shoulder and grabbed a scanner device from the equipment shelf. "I'm not planning to fight it. I'm planning to understand it." "Understand it?" Garvin's voice rose. "There is nothing to understand. It is a predator. We are prey. This is the natural order of the universe." "Maybe on your worlds," Neil said, heading for the door. "But where I come from, we learn to live alongside predators. You just need to respect them and read their behavior." He stepped outside into the chaos of the colony. Colonists were still hiding in buildings, peering through reinforced windows at the razorback that now stood in the central plaza. The creature had stopped charging and was instead sniffing the air, its massive head turning slowly as it scanned its surroundings. Prill ran up to Neil with his communicator clutched in one trembling hand. "The evacuation shuttles are being prepared. Please, human, return to your ship and leave this world. You do not have to die here." "Not planning on dying," Neil said. He studied the razorback through the scanner, reading its biosigns. Elevated heart rate, high-stress hormones, defensive posture. That thing isn't hunting. It's scared. Scared? Prill's three eyes blinked in sequence. That creature fears nothing. It is the most dangerous life form on this planet. Neil shook his head. Everything fears something. Look at how it's moving. See how it keeps its body between us and that gap in the fence? It's guarding something. Garvin had followed them outside and was now watching the razorback with his weapon drawn. It is preparing to attack. When they lower their head like that, it means they are about to charge. No, Neil said quietly. When they lower their head like that, it means they are protecting their neck. That's a defensive move, not an offensive one. The razorback suddenly turned toward a group of maintenance workers who had not made it to shelter. The workers froze, and one of them made a whimpering sound that carried across the plaza. The creature took a step toward them, and Neil could see the tension in its muscles. He handed the scanner to Prill and started walking toward the razorback. Garvin grabbed his arm. "What are you doing?" "Getting between it and those workers," Neil said, pulling free. "If I'm right, it will focus on me instead of them. And if you are wrong, then you can say you told me so at my funeral." Neil walked across the open plaza with steady, measured steps. He kept his hands visible and away from the rifle. His grandfather had taught him this approach when dealing with aggressive bulls. You never showed fear, but you also never showed aggression. You made yourself present without making yourself a threat. The razorback noticed him immediately. Its massive head swung around and those 3 rows of teeth came into full view. Up close, the creature was even bigger than Neil had thought. Its shoulder was level with his head and each of its claws was as long as his forearm. But Neil had faced down a grizzly bear once when he was 17, camping in Yellowstone against his better judgment. That bear had been close enough to smell, close enough to hear its breathing, He had stood still and made himself as large as possible, and the bear had eventually lost interest and walked away. This was bigger. This was more dangerous. But the principle was the same. "Easy there," Neil said in a calm voice. He knew the creature could not understand his words, but tone mattered. Every animal responded to tone. "Nobody here wants to hurt you. We just need to share this space for a while." The razorback roared, and the sound hit Neil like a physical force. Behind him he heard Prill crying out in his own language, probably praying to whatever gods the Trilaxians believed in. But Neil kept his eyes on the creature and watched its body language. The roar was loud, but the posture was still defensive. The creature had not lowered into a charging stance. Its claws were not extended. This was a warning, not an attack. "Yeah, I hear you," Neil said. He took another step forward, and the razorback backed up slightly. That was interesting. The creature was giving ground. "You got babies out there in those rocks, don't you? That's why you keep coming back. You're not hunting colonists. You're trying to scare them away from your nesting area." The razorback swung its head and bellowed again, but there was less aggression in it this time, more confusion. This prey was not running. This prey was not attacking. This prey was doing something the creature had never encountered before. Neil slowly reached up and unslung the rifle from his shoulder. Immediately the razorback tensed, and he heard Garvin shouting at him to shoot. But Neil just lowered the weapon to the ground and kicked it gently away. "See? No weapons, no threat. You can go back to your nest now." The creature stared at him with eyes that held more intelligence than most people gave animals credit for. It took a step forward, and Neil held his ground. His heart was pounding and sweat ran down his back despite the cooling evening air, but he kept his breathing steady and his posture calm. The razorback lowered its head until its snout was less than a meter from Neil's face. It sniffed him, taking in his scent. Its breath was hot and smelled like meat and earth. One snap of those jaws would end him instantly. But Neil had learned long ago that showing fear to a predator only made you interesting. Acting like prey triggered hunting instincts. But standing your ground, showing calm confidence, that confused them, that made them think twice. "We're going to leave your nesting area alone," Neil said softly. "You don't bother us, we don't bother you. Deal?" The razorback pulled back and regarded him with what Neil could swear was curiosity. Then it turned and walked back toward the gap in the fence. It moved with purpose but without panic, keeping its body angled to watch Neil, until it passed through the barrier and disappeared into the rocks beyond. The entire colony was silent for a long moment. Then Prill's voice crackled over the communicator system. "The razorback is retreating. It is leaving the colony perimeter. All security teams, hold your fire." Neil picked up the rifle and walked back toward where Garvin and Prill stood frozen in shock. Other colonists were emerging from their hiding places, staring at him like he had just performed some kind of miracle. "What did you do?" Garvin asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How did you survive that?" Neil shrugged and handed him the rifle. "I grew up on a ranch in Montana. You learned to read animals. That razorback wasn't trying to kill anyone. It was just protecting its young. There's probably a nest about 200 meters past that rock formation. If your colonists stay away from that area for a few weeks, the babies will grow up and the whole family will move on to new territory." Prill's translator struggled with the emotion in his voice. "You faced the most dangerous predator on this planet without firing a shot. You stood before death itself and made it retreat. I stood before a scared parent and showed it I wasn't a threat." Neil corrected. "There's a difference." But as he walked back to his ship to finish the unloading, he could feel dozens of eyes on him. And he could hear the whispers starting among the colonists. The human who faced a razorback. The human who showed no fear. Neil sighed. He had a feeling this story was going to spread, and he was not going to like where it led. 3 days passed before Neil heard about the report. He was loading cargo containers on a station orbiting Proxima Centauri when his communicator buzzed with a message from his captain, Anne Roth. She wanted to see him immediately, and her tone suggested he was in trouble. Anne's office was a cluttered space filled with shipping manifests and star charts. She sat behind her desk with a data pad in her hand and an expression that Neil had learned to recognize as her "you did something stupid but profitable" face. "Sit down," she said. Neil sat. "What did I do?" Anne turned the data pad around to show him a news article from the Galactic Trade Network. The headline read, "Human cargo worker confronts deadly predator unarmed, survives." That Trilaxian administrator on Pharaoh 7 filed an incident report, Anne explained. Except he didn't write it like an incident report. He wrote it like you were some kind of legendary warrior who tamed a monster with your bare hands. I didn't tame anything, Neil protested. I just stood there and let it figure out I wasn't worth the trouble. Well, according to this article, you demonstrated unprecedented bravery in the face of certain death and displayed abilities beyond normal sentient comprehension. It's been shared across 47 colony networks, and now I'm getting messages from aliens who want to hire you, Neil groaned. I'm a cargo handler. I haul boxes, Anne smiled. You were a cargo handler. Now you're apparently the galaxy's premier expert on dangerous wildlife. She slid another datapad across the desk. This one is offering us 50,000 credits for a single consultation. The number made Neil pause. 50,000 credits was more than he made in a year of hauling freight. Who wants to pay that much? A Kepteri merchant named Dolvec. He owns a luxury estate on Sylvanas, one of those garden worlds where rich aliens go to pretend they're close to nature. Except there's something called a Night Stalker that keeps attacking his property, and his security teams can't stop it. Night Stalker? Anne pulled up footage on the wall screen. The video showed a sleek predator about the size of a large wolf, but with 6 legs and a tail tipped with what looked like a blade of bone. Its skin was dark and reflective, almost like liquid shadow. The creature moved with disturbing speed, leaping over barriers and dodging weapons fire with unnatural grace. They're pack hunters, Anne said as the video showed 3 more of the creatures joining the first. Smart, fast, and apparently very angry at Dolvec for building his mansion on their territory. Then the solution is for Dolvec to move, Neil said. Yes, well, Dolvec is very rich and very stubborn. He wants the Night Stalkers gone, and he's willing to pay premium prices for someone who can make that happen. Neil watched the video again. The Night Stalkers moved with coordination that spoke of intelligence. They tested the defenses systematically, probing for weaknesses. One of them looked directly at the camera, and Neil could see calculation in its eyes. I'm not a killer, he said quietly. If that's what he wants, he should hire someone else. Anne leaned back in her chair. I told him that. I said you were a cargo worker who happened to understand animal behavior. He said he didn't care. He wants the human who faced a razorback unarmed. She paused. 50,000 credits, Neil. That's enough to pay off the ship's maintenance debt and upgrade our cargo systems. It's enough to give the whole crew a bonus. Neil thought about his family's ranch back on Earth. His parents were getting older, and the ranch needed repairs they could not quite afford. 50,000 credits converted to a lot of dollars. Enough to fix the barn roof and replace the fence line that kept breaking down. How long would the job take? He asked. Anne smiled because she knew she had won. Dolvec wants you there for 1 week. Observe the Night Stalkers, figure out why they're so aggressive, and recommend a solution. 7 days of work for more money than either of us usually sees in a year. And if I can't figure it out, then you tried and we still get paid a consultation fee of 10,000 credits. Anne stood and extended her hand. What do you say? Want to be the galaxy's weirdest specialist for a little while? Neil shook her hand and tried not to think about what his grandfather would say. The old man had always taught him that understanding animals was about patience and respect, not about money. But the ranch needed help, and this was one way to provide it. 1 week, he said. Then I go back to hauling cargo. The trip to Sylvanas took 4 days through jump points and commercial lanes. Neil spent most of that time researching Night Stalkers through the ship's database. The information was limited but concerning. The species was classified as highly intelligent, with complex social structures and sophisticated hunting strategies. They were native to Sylvanas but had become endangered as colonization expanded. When Anne's ship finally landed at Dolvec's estate, Neil understood immediately why the Night Stalkers were angry. The mansion was enormous, sprawling across several square kilometers of what had clearly been wilderness before construction began. Gardens surrounded the main buildings, all carefully cultivated and completely artificial. Walls and barriers cut through natural paths. The whole place screamed of wealth imposing itself on nature without caring about the consequences. Dolvec met him at the landing pad. The Kepteri was shorter than Neil, with purple-tinged skin and elaborate clothing that probably cost more than Neil's entire year's salary. He looked Neil up and down with obvious skepticism. You are the human? Dolvec asked. You look ordinary. I am ordinary, Neil said. I'm a cargo worker who happens to know animals. My security chief said the same thing before a Night Stalker killed him last month. Dolvec gestured toward the mansion. Come, I will show you what we face. They walked through gardens that should have been beautiful but felt wrong. Everything was too neat, too controlled. Neil noticed scorch marks on some of the walls and deep gouges in the stone that could only have been made by claws. The attacks happen at dusk, Dolvec explained. The Night Stalkers come in groups of 4 or 5. They disable our sensors, breach our defenses, and kill anyone they encounter. We have lost 17 people in the past 3 months. Did anyone try relocating the estate? Neil asked. Dolvec stopped walking and turned to stare at him. This mansion cost me 40 million credits to build. I am not relocating. Then you're going to keep losing people, Neil said flatly. Those creatures were here first. You built on their territory. The Kepteri's face darkened. I hired you to eliminate the threat, not to lecture me about property rights. If you cannot do the job, I will find someone who can. Neil was about to respond when alarms started blaring across the estate. Dolvec's communicator lit up with urgent messages and security teams started running toward the eastern perimeter. They are here, Dolvec said, his voice tight with fear. In daylight. They have never attacked during daylight before. Through the garden paths, Neil could see shadows moving with terrible purpose. The Night Stalkers had come, and they were not just hunting anymore. They were making a statement, and Neil was going to have to figure out what they were trying to say before more people died. The Night Stalkers moved through the garden like smoke given form. Neil counted 7 of them, more than Dolvec had reported in any previous attack. They spread out in a coordinated pattern that spoke of intelligence and planning. These were not mindless beasts. These were tactical hunters who understood their environment and their enemy. Security guards fired plasma bolts that scorched the carefully maintained gardens but never seemed to hit their targets. The Night Stalkers were too fast, too aware. They dodged and weaved, using the artificial landscaping for cover in ways that showed they had been studying the estate's layout. Get inside, Dolvec shouted at Neil, running toward the mansion. The barriers will protect us, but Neil stood still, watching the creatures. One of them, larger than the others and with distinctive scarring along its flank, paused at the edge of the fountain plaza. It looked directly at Neil, and in that moment he understood. They knew he was there. They knew he was different from the other people on the estate. And they were waiting to see what he would do. Turn off the alarms, Neil said. Dolvec, halfway to the mansion door, turned back in disbelief. What? Turn off the alarms and call back your security teams. These creatures aren't here to kill anyone today. They're here to send a message. You are insane, Dolvec said. But something in Neil's voice made him pause. He spoke into his communicator in rapid Kepteri and the alarms went silent. The security guards stopped firing but kept their weapons trained on the Night Stalkers. In the sudden quiet, the scarred leader of the pack took 3 steps forward. The other Night Stalkers remained still, watching their leader. The dynamics were clear to anyone who had worked with pack animals. This was the alpha, and the others would follow its lead. Neil walked toward it. Behind him, Dolvec made a strangled sound of protest, but Neil ignored him. He had done this with the Razorback, and he would do it again here. Understanding required proximity. It required being willing to stand in the presence of danger and read what the danger was trying to communicate. The Night Stalker watched him approach. Its tail swayed slightly, the bone blade catching the light. Its 6 legs were positioned for either fight or flight, ready to react to whatever Neil did next. But it did not attack. It waited. Neil stopped about 3 meters away, close enough to see the intelligence in the creature's eyes, far enough to give it space. You're not here to hunt, he said quietly. You're here because we're on your land and you want us to know that you could kill us anytime you want. This is a warning. The Night Stalker tilted its head and Neil could swear it was listening, not understanding the words but understanding the tone, understanding that this human was different from the ones who had been shooting at it for months. There are babies somewhere nearby, Neil continued, thinking out loud. That's why you're so aggressive. This estate isn't just on your territory, it's on your breeding grounds. Every building, every garden, every wall is destroying the places where your pack needs to raise young. The creature made a sound, low and resonant, that vibrated in Neil's chest. It was not a growl or a roar. It was something more complex, almost like speech. The other Night Stalkers responded with similar sounds, creating a chorus that filled the garden. Then, as suddenly as they had arrived, they withdrew, The Alpha turned and led its pack back toward the perimeter, moving with the same coordinated precision they had shown during the attack. Within moments, they had disappeared into the wilderness beyond the estate walls. Dolvec approached cautiously, flanked by 3 security guards. "What just happened?" "They made their point," Neil said. "They wanted you to know that they could have killed everyone here today if they wanted to. But they didn't, because killing isn't their goal. Protecting their territory is." "This is my property," Dolvec said, his voice rising. "I have legal ownership documents filed with the Colonial Authority. Those animals have no claim here." Neil turned to face the Keptari merchant. "Did the Colonial Authority survey for endangered species before they sold you this land?" Dolvec's expression flickered with something that might have been guilt. "That is not relevant to the current situation." "It's completely relevant," Neil said. "You built a mansion on a breeding ground for one of the planet's most intelligent species. Those Night Stalkers aren't attacking because they're aggressive. They're attacking because they're desperate. You're destroying the only place they can safely raise their young." "Then what do you suggest?" Dolvec asked coldly. "Should I simply abandon 40 million credits worth of construction and leave?" Neil looked around at the sprawling estate, at the artificial gardens and the walls that cut through natural paths, at the sensors and barriers and security systems that treated the planet's native life as enemies to be destroyed. "Yeah," he said. "That's exactly what you should do." Dolvec's face turned a deeper shade of purple. "I hired you to solve the problem, not to tell me to abandon my home. I am solving the problem. The problem is that you built in the wrong place." Neil pulled out his datapad and called up a topographical map of the region. "See this area 10 kilometers north? Similar terrain, good views, no known breeding grounds. You could relocate there and probably never see a Night Stalker. But here?" He gestured at the mansion. "Here you're going to fight them forever and eventually you're going to lose." "I do not lose," Dolvec said. "Everyone loses when they fight nature," Neil replied. "You can kill these 7 Night Stalkers. You can probably kill the next group that comes. But there will always be another group, because this is their home. You're the invader here, not them." For a long moment, Dolvec stared at him with barely contained fury. Then he turned and walked back toward the mansion, his security guards following. Over his shoulder, he called back, "You have wasted my time and my money. I will find someone else to eliminate these creatures." Neil watched him go and felt a familiar frustration settling in his chest. This was the problem with people who had too much money and too much pride. They thought wealth meant they could impose their will on anything, including nature. They never understood that some things could not be bought or controlled. He spent the rest of the day studying the perimeter, looking for where the Night Stalkers had entered and exited. The patterns told him what he needed to know. There was a network of natural paths through the wilderness, routes that the creatures had probably used for generations. Dolvec's estate had been built directly on top of several major paths, forcing the Night Stalkers to either abandon their territory or fight for it. They had chosen to fight. As the sun set and dusk settled over the estate, Neil sat on a garden wall and watched the wilderness beyond. He could see shadows moving in the trees, shapes that might have been Night Stalkers or might have been ordinary animals. The boundary between the manicured gardens and the wild forest was sharp and unnatural, a line drawn by wealth and arrogance. His communicator buzzed. It was Anne. "How's the job going?" "Badly," Neil said. "The client wants me to help him kill intelligent creatures so he can keep a mansion built on their breeding ground." Anne was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to tell him no." Neil stood and started walking back toward the landing pad where their ship waited. Some jobs aren't worth the money. The crew isn't going to be happy about losing that bonus. Then I'll make it up to them some other way. Neil looked back at the mansion one last time. "I'm not helping destroy animals who are just trying to survive." But as he walked away, he could feel eyes on him from the darkness beyond the walls. The Night Stalkers were watching, and he had a feeling this was not over yet. Neil was packing his equipment when the screaming started. He dropped the datapad he was holding and ran back toward the mansion, his heart pounding. The sun had just finished setting, and the estate lights were coming on in automated sequence, casting long shadows across the gardens. Security teams were scrambling toward the eastern wing where staff quarters were located. Plasma fire lit up the dusk, and Neil could hear that distinctive sound the Night Stalkers made, the resonant chorus that was almost like language. But this time there was something different in it, something that sounded like anger. He found Dolvec on the main terrace, surrounded by guards and staring at a security monitor with the expression of shock. On the screen, Neil could see what looked like a construction crew working with heavy equipment near the forest edge. Except the construction was not building anything. It was tearing down trees and clearing vegetation. "What is that?" Neil demanded. Dolvec did not look away from the screen. "I hired a clearance crew this afternoon. If the Night Stalkers want this territory, I will make it worthless to them. No trees means no cover. No cover means they cannot approach safely." "You're destroying their habitat," Neil said, unable to keep the anger from his voice. "You're not just defending yourself. You're attacking them." "I am solving my problem in a permanent way," Dolvec replied. "By morning, 50 hectares of forest will be cleared. The Night Stalkers will have to find new territory, far from my property." On the screen, the construction equipment suddenly shuddered and went dark. The workers scattered as shapes emerged from the remaining trees. Night Stalkers, more than Neil had ever seen in one place. 10, 15, maybe 20 of them, moving with coordinated fury. "They are attacking the clearing crews," one of the security officers reported. "Multiple casualties reported." "Pull them back," Neil said immediately. "Get those workers out of there before more people die." Dolvec shook his head. "If we retreat now, the creatures will think they have won. We push forward. Clear the forest and eliminate any Night Stalkers that interfere." Neil grabbed the Kepteri's shoulder and forced him to make eye contact. "Those workers are going to die. This isn't defense anymore. This is a massacre and you're causing it." "I am protecting my investment," Dolvec said, pulling free. He turned to his security chief. "Send all available teams to support the clearing operation. Lethal force authorized." The security chief nodded and started issuing orders. Neil watched as armed guards assembled and headed toward the forest, their weapons powered and ready. This was exactly what he had been trying to prevent. This was humans and aliens making the same mistake that had been made on Earth countless times, choosing violence over understanding. He made a decision that would probably get him killed. Neil ran toward the forest before anyone could stop him. Behind him, he heard Dolvec shouting commands, but he did not slow down. He reached the edge of the cleared area just as security teams were opening fire on Night Stalkers that were trying to protect their territory. "Stop shooting," Neil yelled, but his voice was lost in the chaos of weapons discharge and roaring creatures. A Night Stalker lunged at a security guard, and Neil threw himself between them. The guard's plasma bolt went wide, scorching the ground near Neil's feet. The Night Stalker stopped its attack, confused by this human who had deliberately put himself in danger. It was the scarred Alpha from earlier, the one who had looked at Neil in the garden, the one who had listened when Neil spoke. "This has to stop," Neil said, breathing hard. "Your pack is going to die if you keep fighting. There are too many weapons, too much firepower. They will kill all of you." The Night Stalker tilted its head, and for a moment Neil thought he saw understanding in its eyes. But then more plasma fire erupted nearby, and the creature's attention snapped back to the immediate threat. It made that resonant sound again, and the other Night Stalkers responded, regrouping around their alpha. Neil turned to face the advancing security teams. "Everyone stop. Lower your weapons. Get out of the way, human," the security chief shouted. "You are in our line of fire." "That's the point," Neil shouted back. "You're killing intelligent creatures who are just trying to protect their home. This is wrong, and I'm not going to let it happen." The security chief raised his weapon, and for a terrible moment, Neil thought the alien was going to shoot him, but then a voice crackled over the communicator system, clear and authoritative. "All teams, cease fire immediately. This is Captain Roth of the merchant vessel Northern Star. I am invoking interstellar wildlife protection protocols. This situation is now under independent investigation." Anne's voice had never sounded better. The security teams hesitated, looking at each other uncertainly. The wildlife protection protocols were part of galactic law, designed to prevent the extinction of intelligent species. If Anne had invoked them, it meant this conflict had just become an official legal matter. Dolvec's voice came through the communicator, sputtering with rage. "You have no authority here, Captain. This is private property, and these are protected creatures under colonial law," Anne replied. "I've been reviewing the surveys filed when this land was purchased. The Colonial Authority classified Night Stalkers as potentially endangered 3 years ago. Your construction permits should never have been approved." Neil could have kissed her. She had found the legal loophole that could save these creatures. The security team slowly lowered their weapons. Behind Neil, the Night Stalkers were still tense and ready to fight. but they had stopped advancing. The scarred Alpha was watching him with those intelligent eyes, and Neil wondered what it was thinking. He turned to face the creature and slowly sat down on the ground, making himself non-threatening. "It's over," he said quietly. "No more fighting tonight." The Night Stalker took a cautious step forward, then another. It approached until it was close enough that Neil could feel its breath, could see the scars from previous fights with security teams. This creature had been fighting for its life and the lives of its pack for months. Neil reached slowly into his pack and pulled out a ration bar, one of the high-protein ones he usually ate on long cargo runs. He broke it in half and held one piece out, not as bait but as a gesture, an offering of peace. The Night Stalker sniffed the food cautiously. Then with deliberate slowness it took the offering from Neil's hand. The touch of its mouth was surprisingly gentle. It ate the ration bar while its pack watched from the shadows, and Neil sat perfectly still, barely breathing. When the food was gone, the Night Stalker made that resonant sound again, but softer this time. Less like a battle cry and more like communication. The other Night Stalkers emerged from the forest, moving carefully around the construction equipment and the scattered workers, and gathered around their Alpha. Neil stood slowly and backed away, giving them space. The pack watched him for a long moment, and then the Alpha dipped its head in what might have been acknowledgement, or gratitude, or simply recognition that this human was different from the others. Then they melted back into the forest, leaving Neil standing in the cleared area surrounded by confused security guards and damaged equipment. The communicator crackled. "Neil, get back to the ship," Anne said. "We need to leave before Dolvec decides to ignore the wildlife protocols and shoot everyone." "On my way," Neil replied. He walked past the security teams, past the construction workers who stared at him like he was something they could not quite understand, and headed back toward the landing pad. Behind him, the forest was silent. But he could feel eyes watching from the darkness, and he knew the Night Stalkers would remember this night. The question was whether it would be enough to save them. 2 weeks after the incident on Sylvanas, Neil was back to hauling cargo like nothing had happened. Except everything had happened, and the galaxy would not let him forget it. The wildlife protection investigation had shut down Dolvec's estate pending a full environmental survey. Early reports suggested that not only were Night Stalkers endangered, but the land had been sold illegally in the first place. Dolvec was facing massive fines and possible criminal charges for violating colonial preservation laws. Neil tried not to feel too satisfied about that. What he could not avoid was the attention. The story had spread even faster than the Razorback incident. News networks across 3 sectors were running features about the human who walked between armed guards and intelligent predators to stop a massacre. Some called him a hero, others called him reckless. A few called him stupid. Neil just wanted to load cargo and be left alone. "You have 17 more interview requests," Anne said, walking into the cargo bay where Neil was checking inventory. 3 documentary producers, 5 news networks, and 9 private individuals who want to hire you for various animal-related problems. "Tell them all no," Neil said, not looking up from his data pad. "I already did, but they keep offering more money." Anne sat on a crate and studied him. "You know you could make a real career out of this. Animal behavior consultant for colonies dealing with dangerous wildlife. The demand is clearly there. I'm a cargo handler. You're a cargo handler who can do something that apparently no one else in the galaxy can do." Anne pulled up a file on her own data pad. "Listen to this one. A mining colony on Kepler 7b is having issues with burrowing creatures that keep breaking through into their tunnels. They are offering 80,000 credits for a 2-week consultation." Neil finally looked up. "You mean Kepler 449b? What? Kepler 7b is a gas giant. You can't have a mining colony there." Neil went back to his inventory. "And I'm not interested." Anne sighed and stood. "Fine. But you should know that the Galactic Trade Union is considering creating a new position, Interspecies Wildlife Relations Consultant. They want you to be the first one. Tell them to find someone else." "There is no one else, Neil, that's the point." Anne walked toward the door, then paused. "You did something important on Sylvanas. You showed that humans can solve problems without violence when everyone else wanted to shoot first. That matters to people." After she left, Neil tried to focus on his work, but his communicator kept buzzing with messages. Most were from strangers congratulating him or asking for help. but one caught his attention. It was from Prill, the Trilaxian administrator from Pharaoh 7. The message was simple. The Razorback family moved on last week. 3 healthy juveniles spotted heading north. Colony is safe and grateful. Thank you for showing us a better way. Neil smiled despite himself. That at least had worked out. His next message was a video call request from Earth. He accepted it, and his nephew's face appeared on the screen. The kid was 10 years old and obsessed with space, constantly asking Neil about alien worlds and creatures. Uncle Neil, Mom says you were on the news again. Yeah, buddy. It wasn't a big deal. You stopped a war between humans and aliens.
That's the coolest thing ever!
The kid's enthusiasm was infectious. Are the alien animals scary? Neil thought about the razorback protecting its nest, about the Night Stalker Alpha accepting food from his hand, about all the creatures he had encountered that were just trying to survive in a changing galaxy. Not really, he said. They're just animals doing what animals do. They're not scary if you take time to understand them. But everyone says you're so brave. I'm not brave. I just grew up around animals like your grandparents did. When you understand how creatures think, they're less frightening and more interesting. Neil paused. How's the ranch doing? Good. Grandpa fixed the barn roof with the money you sent. He says you didn't have to do that. I wanted to. Neil glanced around the cargo bay at the crates waiting to be unloaded, at the life he had built away from Earth. Tell him I'll visit when we pass through the Sol system next month. After the call ended, Neil sat quietly for a while. The cargo bay was familiar and comfortable, filled with the ordinary work he had been doing for years. But something had shifted. He could feel it in the way other crew members looked at him now, in the messages that kept coming, in the way the galaxy suddenly seemed interested in what a simple cargo handler from Montana had to say. Anne returned an hour later with printed documents. Before you say no, just look at these. Neil took the papers reluctantly. They were contracts from 3 different colonies, all offering substantial payments for consultation on wildlife management issues. The problems ranged from creatures damaging equipment to predators threatening workers. None of them wanted the animals killed. They all specifically requested someone who could find non-violent solutions. These colonies learned about what you did, Anne explained. They don't want exterminators. They want someone who can help them coexist with the planets they're living on. That's rare in this galaxy, Neil. Most species see wildlife as obstacles to be removed. Neil read through the contracts slowly. The money was significant, but that was not what caught his attention. It was the descriptions of the problems. Creatures being displaced by construction. Animals attacking because their territories were being destroyed. The same patterns he had seen on Pharaoh 7 and Sylvanas playing out across multiple worlds. What if I said yes to one of these? He asked carefully. Just one to see if I could actually help, Anne smiled. Then I would say you're finally accepting what the rest of us already knew. You're good at this, Neil. Better than anyone else we've encountered. I'm just a guy from Montana who grew up around animals. Exactly. And in a galaxy where most species evolved on worlds that were safer than Earth, that makes you uniquely qualified. Anne gestured at the contracts. You don't have to become some famous consultant if you don't want to. But you could help these colonies avoid making the same mistakes Dolvec made. You could save lives on both sides. Neil looked at the papers again, then at the cargo containers waiting to be moved, then back at the contracts. His grandfather had always said that understanding animals was about respect and patience. His grandmother had taught him that every creature had a reason for what it did, even when that reason looked like aggression. Maybe the galaxy needed to learn those lessons. One contract, he said finally. I'll take one and see how it goes. But I'm still a cargo handler. This is just a side job, Anne grinned. Sure, a side job that pays more than your main job. That makes total sense. 3 months later, Neil stood on the edge of a forest on a colony world called New Hebrides, watching a pack of creatures the locals called thornbacks. They were massive herbivores with plates of bone covering their backs, and they had been attacking supply convoys for the past 2 months. The colony administrators wanted them driven away or killed. But Neil had spent a week observing their behavior, and he had figured out the real problem. The colonists had built their main road directly through a migration route that the thornbacks had used for generations. The creatures were not attacking out of aggression. They were trying to get past an obstacle that should not have been there. The solution was simple. Reroute the road 3 kilometers west and leave a wildlife corridor open. The colony would have to rebuild part of their infrastructure, but they would not have to fight thornbacks every supply run. It will cost millions to relocate the road, the colony governor protested. It will cost more in damaged vehicles and injured people if you don't, Neil replied. Plus, you'll be able to market this place as a wildlife-friendly colony. Some people pay extra to live in places that respect native species. The governor looked skeptical, but agreed to present Neil's proposal to the colony council. As Neil walked back to his ship, his communicator buzzed with another message. Another colony, another wildlife problem, another opportunity to help aliens understand what his grandparents had taught him years ago on a ranch in Montana. Understanding was always better than violence. Patience was always better than fear. And every creature, no matter how dangerous it seemed, was just trying to survive in the only way it knew how. Neil smiled and accepted the next contract. Maybe Anne was right. Maybe this was more than a side job, but he was still going to haul cargo when he got the chance because some things were too familiar to give up completely.